You are live on Truth Wanted with Objectively Dan. Hello, hello.
Hello, hello. It's Delon from Irvine, California. How's it going?
Hey, how's it going, Delon?
Hey, man. Just thought I'd call back. I know we had a nice conversation last week, and Ty and you guys gave me a lot to think about. So I just wanted to give you guys a call back and
yes, that was
the show.
That was a really fun conversation last week. I'm really glad you got to call back. Yeah,
because I know you said you had other questions that we kind of got sidetracked from, and I wanted to maybe you could give me some things to think about, maybe give me some ideas here that might help me out on that whole discussion, you know?
Yeah, so if you want, can you kind of maybe remind the audience who wasn't here last week what we were kind of talking about and stuff, and maybe what you've been thinking about since then?
Absolutely, absolutely. So the topic of the conversation was consciousness is fundamental in the universe, was my proposition, and fundamental meaning irreducible. Mm-hmm. And so we kind of went on and talked about that, and one thing led to another, so we kind of went into that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so what has some of the stuff you've been thinking about since then? Like, what has changed since that conversation?
Yeah, well, Ty said something that was really interesting at the end. He was mentioning that if you can't really distinguish between two worldviews, then there's really no, I guess, no value, or there's nothing that you can really say about it one way or the other if two worldviews kind of equal the same thing. One of the things that I was saying was with consciousness being a fundamental property, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm adding anything or that anything really changes in the real world, that what we observe are simply the contents of the consciousness that we have. Mm-hmm. And so Ty was saying, well, being that that's the case, then there's really no difference between a materialistic worldview and a consciousness-based worldview, I guess. And so I got to thinking about that. It's a pretty powerful point. And I kind of looked into it, thought about it, read a lot about it, was looking at, kind of ran across something called Russellian monism. Mm-hmm. And basically what happens is, and it kind of got me to thinking that maybe the problem isn't so much a hard problem of consciousness. It may be a hard problem of matter and energy that I'm talking about, right?
Okay.
So the idea in that case, and it's kind of the same thing, basically what is matter? Is it really understood completely? You know, and what I come to find out is that today there's no really definitive answers to that question either. Mm-hmm. There's not even a consensus about what the answer should even look like. Rather, there's like multiple interpretations of quantum theory, which corresponds to a very different way of regarding matter and everything about it. Basically, that means everything, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, and the bigger point is, as yet, since there's no way to experimentally, if you will, distinguish between these different interpretations of quantum mechanics, then it kind of leads to the same situation that Ty was referring to. Mm-hmm. So whichever one we mainly, whichever explanation of quantum mechanics we choose is kind of arbitrary. So we kind of just depend on what, philosophical temperament you may have, right?
Yeah, I think
this arbitrariness in deciding which interpretation to hold completely undermines the strict materialist position by definition.
Yeah, it's
because you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, for sure. I get 100% what you're saying. And I just want to clarify for those of you who aren't keeping up with this conversation, because we're throwing around a lot of terms here. This is like philosophy of science kinds of stuff. So this problem has gone back for long stretches of time. It's been changed by a lot of different points of view, and quantum mechanics has also changed that point of view as well. It's this idea of how we can know the things that we know on the most basic of levels. because ultimately we are things made of matter and mass, and things interacting with other things made of matter and mass, and we're part of the same system that we are kind of observing, and that kind of makes some problems when it comes to evaluating things. So you may have heard of this thing with like the Copenhagen theory of quantum mechanics or interpretation of quantum mechanics. I mean, there's all kinds of these sciencey terms and stuff, but basically it's this idea of when you're analyzing two different. I should clarify. I have no idea what I'm talking about, right? I have not gone to college to study physics or anything like that. But my basic level of understanding is when you're observing something, you know, you're using like light and like maybe some other kinds of particles or things in the universe to observe other parts of the universe, and the act of actually observing things can actually affect what's going on in the quantum realm. That's one interpretation of the things that we're seeing, and it's because we're using very specific tools to measure these things, and you know, we're making very specific measurements, and it all comes down to this idea of like what's even real, right? What is like outside of the universe? What does that even mean? What's inside? And it can all be really, really, really confusing and really, really huge. It's quite a topic to start on tonight's show, but I'm glad that like Ty's observation of like what we were talking about last week kind of, you know, made you think about this a little bit more, because most of the stuff that we're talking about here goes over most people's heads. It goes over my head when we talk about this stuff, right? And it doesn't matter to the daily life of people, but to the people who think about this a lot, who make careers out of talking about this kind of stuff, like it's really, really fascinating when you get into it.
Yeah, it definitely is. And, you know, I'm not an expert either by any stretch of the imagination. I just, you know, it all starts from really simple questions. You know, what is reality? What is real? You know, like I mentioned last week, you know, I engage in street epistemology. I'm always asking people and coworkers and friends, how do they arrive at the things that they believe? How do you get there? Mm-hmm. And I just apply that same method to myself. And then I start thinking about, well, what is the absolute fundamental or premise of my epistemology, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's that I'm conscious. Mm-hmm. And going from there, I can kind of ask about the reality of, you know, what's the nature of reality? And it just kind of took me on this deep rabbit hole, of course. And I'm not the only one that has these sort of questions. Nothing new. Like you mentioned last week, it goes all the way, even before Descartes, all the way back to, you know, Plato and Socrates. And it goes way, way, way back. And, you know, some of the confusion there is, to me, is everything just seems like, you know, culturally, especially here in the Western culture, we sort of, if you look at the history of religion and science, you know, science used to be called natural philosophy. Mm-hmm. And it was kind of an agreement that, you know, natural philosophy wouldn't step on matters of spirit and vice versa, right? Mm-hmm. And so science itself kind of set up this objective sort of way of looking at nature. It definitely wouldn't look at things like soul, spirit, God, any type of those type of questions. But, you know, the thing is, as science progressed, especially with quantum mechanics, we start having, you know, the observer effect, and a lot of these things started coming out that pointed to consciousness role in the universe. I mean, as it turns out, we're not really objective because we're part of the universe that we're observing, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And if consciousness is part of reality, then
except me,
it's also part.
I'm objectively Dan, so that.
Yeah, I know. yeah, exactly. But
some people don't get that about my name. That
rarely.
Yeah, I just want a side comment. Some people don't get that my name like purposely doesn't actually make any sense, and that it's just kind of a joke thing. It's a whole explanation of why I think it's personally funny. But some people take my name and they say, "Oh, you're supposed to be objective about everything. You're objectively Dan." It's like, not really. I'm just, I don't know. I'm as objective as the next guy on a lot of things.
It's kind of curious.
Yeah.
atheism, right? Like, you know, whenever I read Objectively Dan, it kind of reminds me of Ayn Rand in a way.
Oh, well, no, my name has nothing to do with objectivism, the philosophy, for sure. Definitely not. Okay. No, yeah, my name quickly, I guess, because I don't think I've actually told this story on air, so I'll go ahead and say it. It comes from this idea of talking about objective morality. This was something that I thought about a lot when I was kind of on my way out of Christianity, of whether we could call something objectively good or objectively bad. And I just thought, like, I had questions about whether that was even a coherent thing, because it almost sounded like you were using names for something that could be replaced with anything else. Like, oh, you could say that's objectively good. I could say that this is objectively Dan, you know, because it's because it's words and it's semantics, and it's just kind of funny the way that we can combine these things that don't actually mean anything unless you give a certain context to them. So now my name is Objectively Dan because I say it's Objectively Dan, which makes it Objectively Dan. Like, from a certain standpoint, I mean, it's still, you can argue about whether or not that's actually subjective or not. Whatever, it doesn't matter. Like, see, these rabbit holes, they keep going down and down and down. Like, my name is just kind of a reflection of this kind of nonsense world we live in sometimes that needs to be worked out and talked about with people. But anyway, I was interrupting you. You were talking a bit more about your idea of the history of science.
Yeah, so, yeah, we kind of established that. That's kind of where, you know, as far as my education goes, that's how I understand it, at least here in the West, is that this objective type of viewpoint kind of saturated natural philosophy.
Yes.
And that principle has always kind of stuck. And quantum mechanics kind of threw a wrench in that whole Newtonian physics, mechanics type of idea of a clock, you know, a watch, you know, clock mechanical universe, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Very random, very weird, and there's all kinds of interpretations about why we have all this quantum weirdness, and I don't want to get into all of that.
For sure. But you make an excellent point. You do make this excellent point that the history of Western science, as we've noted, has been this, a lot of it has been this categorization of things. And sometimes it has led to problems. Like people have rightfully pointed out, just because like the scientific consensus of something is out there does not mean that that thing is true. I mean, for example, I mean, this idea of phrenology was a science of itself, and it relates back to this idea of like scientific racism, this idea that we can categorize people into these hierarchies based on these quote unquote objective values of people. And which can lead to like strife in people because people think they have this information in them that's objective, that makes it somehow right or more correct, when really it's just it's this more like a categorization of certain types of knowledge and even facts, which facts is another word in itself that has problems, because you can call a fact maybe an empirically established, you know, point of data. But even that can have problems because what you mean by empirical. So, you know, there's these problems that we use in our language that that creates kind of these hierarchies that separate people and bounds people into these boxes that, you know, we've kind of been breaking out of in recent years with how we, you know, categorize and identify ourselves. The LGBT movement is a great example of that. It used to be, of course, that homosexuality was categorized as this mental illness. Which is not the view, and it hasn't been the view for many decades now, but it still has been an idea culturally ingrained in people's minds. So even science as a culture can, or a scientific culture, if you will, can affect the way that we process our information and, you know, affect the way that we can understand the world in a way. And
well, that, absolutely. I mean, you know, talking about fundamental consciousness, like I said, there's different versions of fundamental consciousness, and a lot of this stuff, you know, especially in the beginning years, I think I started looking at this stuff about maybe 10 years ago, and even at that time, because at that time science really started to take consciousness serious, but it was more or less the neural correlations of consciousness type of study, you know, that kind of stuff. And only recently have they really been looking at panpsychism, these other versions of fundamental consciousness type of ideas. And one of the things that kind of was the big problem for so many years was that, well, it just seems like to postulate or suggest something like fundamental consciousness seems so unintuitive and it seems so weird or strange in some way. But remember, I mean, the theory of relativity, the fact that time slows down as you speed up, I mean, evolution, the fact that we're related to common ancestors like apes, all of this stuff was unintuitive too.
Yes.
Really crazy.
Now, I
Even
would be
quantum mechanics. We were just talking about that. I mean,
yeah.
So being strange doesn't necessarily equal false.
That's true. Although I would be careful because that same and it is a valid criticism, I'd say, or point of defense that you're making. But there's a lot of people who practice this kind of woo. You know, this kind of really out there stuff that will say the exact same thing. And they'll say, well, you know, they used to believe that the earth was flat, which, like, you know, wasn't the case for a lot of European history, at least. And be like, oh, you know, this is just the next revolution in science. You know, we just need the big scientific people to accept this. They're refusing to accept this because they're dogmatic. These are the same people who, I mean, creationism, for example. A lot of people in the creationist movement say this about scientists who talk about evolution. So, you know, I agree with you in that we should be open-minded and we should be looking towards other explanations for things. But we need a certain criteria on how we accept these explanations and not just accept any kind of speculation, right?
There you go. Thank you so much. That's a really good point. Because, a lot of the resistance to a lot of ideas are because it gets kind of mixed up with the tinfoil hat crowd, you know, and the, you know, pseudoscience crowd. You know, I met one, you know, speaking of that, you know, I had the pleasure of meeting a professor. He's a neuroscientist. He's got a background in physics, and he teaches out here at the University of Irvine, right? And he's postulating the fun, and this is where a lot of my ideas come from. Just being able to sit down and talk with him, and you know, he teaches, you know, his approach to this whole thing. And he told me one good point that he said, you know, the difference between science and pseudoscience is science seeks to disprove hypotheses.
Yes.
And pseudoscience works backwards. You know, pseudoscience makes a hypothesis or some kind of theoretical idea and seeks to prove it, which is the most easiest thing you can do.
Yes.
Right? And he says, so when I'm studying this fundamental consciousness question, I'm not trying to prove it's true. I'm trying to disprove it, right? And that's the difference. You go into it with a whole different mindset. And, you know, and there's a lot of progress being made in that front, mathematically and everything else that you kind of, you know, hit me to. But, yeah, it's to your point, you know, you've got to be careful. There's a lot of woo-woo people out there that smuggle in. That's why I always say, even if consciousness is fundamental, it shouldn't change anything about what we observe. I mean, patterns and irregularities in nature still hold true. Why would they all of a sudden miracles become true and all of that? Right?
Yes, for sure. And this idea of disconfirmation goes back to this guy named Karl Popper, who talked about the science of the philosophy of science, excuse me. And this the word of this is called this, you know, falsification. I like you know, disconfirming things is also another way of saying it, but it's this idea that we can, like I've said this before, explanations for things are cheap. You can make explanations for anything. You know, I could say all the lights are working in here because there's a spiritual manifestation in each one of these light bulbs that happens to react every single time we turn the light switches on. Like, okay, so that's coherent, right? I mean, like, at least there's some form of logic to it, because there are different kinds of logic. There's some form of logic to it. But how do we know that that explanation is true? And we can test it with other explanations and see which one of these, you know, there's a couple of different things. I mean, like Occam's razor is one way of looking at it, you know, seeing what the fewest kinds of assumptions we can make. And again, I mean, this is a whole other conversation, but I think it's important that we even have these kinds of conversations in the first place, because like you're saying, pseudoscience in general is trying to make these all-encompassing theories about everything that we see, and it kind of leads people into these traps, because the more explanations you have for something that explain like the most amount of data, sometimes it's hard to get out of those explanations. A great example I have of this is this idea of the Earth being 6,000 years old. You know, if you talk to somebody, you said, oh, well, you know, if I said, well, you know, the evidence kind of makes it look like, based on this, this, and this, that the Earth is actually several million years old. And then somebody could say, well, you know, God made the Earth look old. You know, like that's a thing that people say and people put out there. So it's like, okay, well, how do you defeat that, or not defeat that, but, you know, how do you engage with that kind of thinking? Because again, you're making more and more assumptions, and you're expanding unproven ideas. Right, because we haven't even established the existence of a God, like in this conversation scenario. So, again, it's a whole thing of conversations. But I'm really glad that you are taking some of this to heart, because like this is what I love, this kinds of stuff. But it can be kind of deep for some people, like especially if you're not initiated in what a lot of these perspectives are talking about. Right. But I'm really glad that you're invested in this. Sorry?
Did you have any questions that you? I mean,
I'll ask you this one question, because Ty brought this up last week, and it was this idea of, okay, so consciousness is fundamental to your worldview. Have you figured out a way of comparing, you know, your idea of the world with another idea? Do you have a method by which you can demonstrate that your ideas are true? Have you figured out any way to verify that? Or is that something you're still thinking about?
Yeah, I've got some idea. I mean, of course, it's an ongoing, you know, look, but I mean, I've got some really base ideas here. Mm-hmm. If you look at, you know, I think we talked about emergence a little bit before. Mm-hmm. And, you know, with the strict materialists, they're saying that dumb matter, somehow if you just combine enough dumb matter in the right way, voila, genie comes out of the bottle. And you've got consciousness, right? And so that creates like a huge, you know, combination fallacy and a huge categorical error, because you're talking about physical properties leading to something immaterial like consciousness or thoughts or something like that. Mm-hmm. So those are the two things that kind of turn me off from materialism just from the get-go. There's other things, but that's the main thing. But with fundamental consciousness, I can see, and this is kind of demonstrated within nature itself, is that let's say that emergence is true. Let's say that, you know, our neurons in our brains are like little supercomputers that are all intelligent on their own. They network together and they kind of emerge into this super consciousness that we have, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's, even below that, there's certain things that account for how neurons work, you know, the combination of things. Well, the only way that emergence is going to work in that way is if pieces of matter, there's some sort of inner life to matter. I mean,
what do you mean by inner life to matter?
Yeah, like,
what makes that
science
different from like regular life?
Science. Yep.
I guess.
So let's take, there's a concept out here called proto-consciousness, right? It's this idea that if, you know, something as small as an electron or a molecule or something like this has some sort of awareness. I mean, it may be unimaginably, you know, measurable, but we see it because it reacts to its environment and it reacts within itself. In other words, it has a cause onto itself. It causes things to happen even to itself, whether that's to, you know.
Okay.
Let me give you an example.
Before you give me the example, I wanna clear some things up here. I believe I want to say Dinesh D'Souza was one that kind of talked about this idea that even like molecules and bits of matter had consciousness. And I think like you're kind of skirting around. I don't know if this is what you mean when you say this, but it's kind of similar to this idea that you're talking about the tiniest bits of matter have consciousness within themselves. And you're saying that putting these things together somehow makes a bigger consciousness.
Like a principle. It may even be like a principle that, you know, we need to discover.
That's interesting. That is interesting.
Because
my first reactions to this is, why would we assume that because these things can, like, matter reacts in a certain way that, like, why would we even call that consciousness? What are we calling here at the base level that you know, that we get to call consciousness? Because clearly, like, there's bits of matter that are happening at, like, the local level. Are we saying that this is the same thing that's happening at the macro level? If we say that, I mean, do we need to call that consciousness in order for that to, do you see what I'm saying? Like, I think that...
Yep, I see what you're saying.
Mm-hmm. Like, how do we know that emergence isn't just, you know, a property that comes from, you know, matter coalescing together? Why do the individual bits need to be conscious in order for consciousness to come from, you know, individual bits?
So that takes care of the genie out of the bottle problem, because that's the whole problem, what they call the hard problem of consciousness.
Hard problem of consciousness, yeah.
Right. The hard problem of consciousness is defined and it's accepted by most of science. They know that this is a hard problem to solve. It's really a big mystery. And the reason it's a mystery is because of the assumption that matter is dumb. It has no principles or any way of leading to consciousness. Like, I'm not saying that rocks are consciousness or anything like that. But if particles, if, you know, subatomic particles all the way up to particles like atoms have some sort of intrinsic awareness, or I don't even know if you want to call it consciousness. Maybe we don't call it consciousness.
But see,
maybe we call it something else. But whatever it is, whatever that ingredient is, whenever a system integrates that information and is able to process that information in a systematic way, then the light show turns on. The light and sound show may turn on, especially in brains, to whatever extent. Like, it's just kind of arbitrary to create this dividing line that separates something from conscious and something that's not.
Well, I don't know. Let me give you an example of why I might disagree with that. Just as a counterpoint, because I don't know either way. But, like, for example, this cup, this one doesn't anymore, but this cup has water in it. And we know that water has hydrogen and oxygen molecules. And we know that a property of water is wetness. You know, wetness is kind of, you know, some would say intrinsic to water, or helps what defines what makes water, right? But do the hydrogen molecules and the oxygen molecules, do they have to be wet themselves in order for, you know, that to be a thing? And, you know, my understanding of chemistry, which is pretty low compared to, like, other sciences, would have to say no, because we know that when we combine these things in other forms and stuff, that, you know, they don't have to necessarily be wet. So, you know, for me, I'm saying this idea that consciousness is actually an emergent property, it seems to still fit with what I understand of how science can operate, or how molecules can operate, I should say. I don't know that I have to agree with the premise that says that individual molecules have some sort of consciousness, if that makes sense.
So this is my only reservation about that.
Okay.
Is wetness a physical property?
Okay. So that's interesting, because we have to know what physical property means, right? So I don't know.
Yeah. And see, that's where I'm at too, because wetness, for me, if I'm gonna take the word of it from say I speak to a materialist, right? It says, yeah, you know, water is, everything's material. The entire universe is material. Everything is, right? So then they say, so wetness is a physical thing. Well, then it's no big deal that you can combine two physical things to emerge a different physical phenomenon. That's fine. That's totally logical, and I agree with that 100%. But what we're talking about is physical properties giving rise to immaterial properties.
Now, okay, but have we ruled out the idea that mind is a physical thing, though? Like, it's just a physical thing.
Very good. There we go. Now we're getting down to it, right? So exactly. So my thing is that mind and material are combined, because when we talk about fundamental, we're talking about irreducible. So if, and I'm not going to say that this is necessarily the case, but if material has some sort of principle, or it's embedded with some sort of inner life to it or inner subjective, you know, perspective to it, that then it would make sense that emergence could happen and bring about consciousness if, you know, configured the right way, right?
Yeah.
That would make sense, because now we're talking about the same sort of substance leading to a different pattern of substance. It's just like emergence within behavior, right? Let's say like weather. You know, the hurricanes are, you know, become hurricanes because of the warm water in the ocean that meets with the air above it, and it kind of changes. Or you can look at the financial markets, you know, certain trends and confidence for what the president may say or do will affect, you know, maybe trade, which affects, you know, the way people
chaos theory,
you know,
essentially,
behavior, you know, all of this is kind of behavior, you know, those type of examples of emergence, they all seem to stick together within their context, you know, like, but you wouldn't expect behavior to lead to some physical thing, right? And vice versa. I mean, so that's what I mean. It just seems a little more consistent.
Ooh, okay. Yeah. Gosh, this is, I want to keep going with this conversation, Delon. This is so great, but we have been talking for a little while now, and we have other callers that want to talk. I would absolutely love it if you called again next week and we can continue this conversation, because this has been one of my favorites so far on this show. I really enjoyed this a lot.
Oh, me too, man. And you guys always give me stuff to think about, so I do appreciate that, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, so I'm going to go ahead and end this now so we can move on to other topics. But thanks again for calling, man. I look forward to this next week if you can.
All right, brother. No problem.
All right.